the day Jacob became a father was the happiest day of his life. After 10 years of waiting and countless prayers, he finally welcomed his baby girl, Ella. She was his everything, the answer to his prayers and the miracle that silenced every mocking whisper from relatives who doubted him. When the doctor placed her in his arms, Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. His joy knew no bounds, and from that moment, he vowed to give her the best life possible. When Jacob brought Ella home from the hospital, he called all his domestic staff into the living room. His face was stern, his tone commanding. "Listen carefully," he began. "This child is my world. If anything happens to her, you will answer to me." The room fell silent as the staff nodded nervously. Jacob made it clear that no one was allowed to scold or touch Ella without his permission. He was determined to be her protector, her hero, and the father he had always dreamed of being, and nothing would stop him now. As Ella grew older, she clung to her father like glue. Jacob rarely left her side, and even when busy, he made sure Ella was close by. His wife, Nora, began to feel uneasy. She often raised concerns about her observations, but they always fell on Jacob's deaf ears. He was blinded by the love he had for his daughter, his only child. "Ella loves me, there's nothing wrong with that," Jacob would laugh off Nora's concerns. By the time Ella turned 3, her attachment became concerning. Instead of playing with the neighbor's children, she trailed after her father, tugging at his shirt and demanding his attention. If Jacob laughed with Nora or hugged her, Ella would throw tantrums, crying, "Daddy, stop. I'm your best friend." At some point, Nora grew frustrated. "Jacob, this isn't normal. She's too attached, let her learn independence. This is not how to raise a child." "She just loves me," Jacob replied with a shrug. "You're reading too much into it." As time passed, Jacob's love for Ella deepened in ways that puzzled Nora. He let her get away with things most parents wouldn't tolerate. If any staff member upset Ella, Jacob wouldn't hesitate to fire them. His entire world revolved around his daughter. One morning, after his shower, Jacob walked into Ella's room to greet her. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, absorbed in her tablet. Jacob, wrapped in a towel, leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Good morning, sweetheart." Ella giggled and asked innocently, "Daddy, why are you wet?" Jacob chuckled and playfully shook his hair, thinking nothing of her innocent curiosity. Moments like this became more frequent, small interactions that seemed harmless but slowly blurred the lines, and Jacob was not seeing anything wrong with it. One evening, as Jacob and Ella played on the bed, their housekeeper, Maria, entered the room. "Sir, I came to get Ella ready for her bath." The moment Ella saw Maria, she began to wail. "Oh, I don't want her. She pinches me." Jacob's face darkened. Without investigating the truth, he dismissed Maria on the spot. "Sir, she's lying," Maria pleaded, tears in her eyes. "Are you calling my daughter a liar? Pack your things and leave," Jacob shouted at the top of his voice. From that day on, Jacob took over Ella's bathing routine. The two became inseparable. They spent their days together, ate together, and even shared the same bed when Nora was out of town. But as Ella grew older, her behavior changed. She began asking unsettling questions about Jacob's body and stared at him with an intensity that made Nora uncomfortable. One day, Nora's mother, Grandma Agnes, visited. She watched the way Ella hovered around Jacob and couldn't stay silent. "Jacob, I know you love your daughter, but this closeness is becoming unhealthy," Grandma Agnes warned, her voice filled with concern. Jacob waved her off. "She's just a child, you're overthinking it." Grandma Agnes shook her head. "Children are not as clueless as you think. You're crossing boundaries, and this can backfire." By the time Ella turned 15, the once sweet little girl had become territorial and bold. She barely spoke to her peers, preferring to follow her father everywhere he went. Her teachers complained about her attitude, especially toward male staff. She would argue, challenge their authority, and lash out if reprimanded. "She's just independent," Jacob defended her, brushing off the reports. But Ella's behavior only got worse. she began interrupting Jacob's conversations, glaring at anyone who spent too much time with him. One day, their neighbor, Mr. Johnson, paid them a visit. "You've raised a beautiful daughter, Jacob," Mr. Johnson said with a warm smile. But before anyone could react, Ella shoved Mr. Johnson, yelling, "Don't talk to him." Her face was red with anger. Jacob pulled her aside. "Ella, what's wrong with you?" She crossed her arms defiantly. "You're mine, Daddy. No one else can have you." That night, Nora confronted Jacob. "Can you see what's happening? She's not acting like your daughter, she's acting like someone who thinks she owns you." "She's just protective," Jacob muttered, though his confidence was beginning to crack. "It's not normal, Jacob. She needs boundaries." Nora shouted, tears in her eyes. Jacob refused to listen. He continued to shower Ella with affection, blind to the storm brewing. One afternoon, as Jacob was sorting laundry, he noticed a notebook sticking out of Ella's bag. Curious, he opened it, and his heart pounded as he read disturbing messages. "No one will take Daddy from me. I'll do whatever it takes to keep him." Jacob's hands shook as he read page after page of obsessive notes. He closed the book, hoping it was just a phase, but deep down, fear began to grow. One evening, as Jacob cooked dinner, Ella walked in and sat at the table, watching him silently. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked, forcing a smile. "Daddy, there's something I need to tell you," Ella whispered. Jacob put down the spoon and sat beside her. "Go ahead, honey." "I love you," she said softly. "I mean really love you." Jacob's stomach twisted. "Of course you love me, I'm your dad." Ella shook her head. "No, Daddy, it's different. You're the only person I've ever wanted." Jacob stood up, his heart pounding. "Ella, what are you saying?" Before he could move, Ella grabbed his arm. "You don't understand, Daddy. We belong together. You're mine." Just then, Nora walked in and froze, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" she asked. Before Jacob could explain, Ella rushed toward her mother. "You're trying to take him away from me." Nora's eyes widened in shock. Jacob held Ella back as she trashed and screamed. For the first time, Jacob realized that what he thought was love had become something dark and dangerous. Nora called the police. When they arrived, Jacob stood helplessly as Ella was taken into custody. She screamed for him as she was led away. Jacob sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. How did it come to this? Nora sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," she whispered. Jacob nodded, though his heart was shattered. He finally understood that love without boundaries could turn into something destructive. Though the road ahead would be painful, he was determined to help Ella heal and to mend their family. Just as the house settled into a haunting silence after Ella's departure, Jacob received a phone call that sent a shiver down his spine. The officer on the line sounded grim. "Mr. Jacob, there's something you need to know. Ella escaped during transport." Jacob's heart sank. "How?" he stammered, but the call abruptly ended. A deafening knock suddenly echoed at the front door. Jacob and Nora exchanged fearful glances before cautiously opening it. There stood Ella, drenched from the rain, her eyes wide with rage and tears streaming down her face. Before they could react, Ella stepped inside, clutching a kitchen knife. "I told you, Daddy, no one would take you from me," she whispered, her voice eerily calm yet trembling with emotion. Nora's scream pierced the air as Jacob shielded her, his mind racing for a way to calm his daughter down. But Ella wasn't backing down. The look in her eyes was unrecognizable, a volatile mix of heartbreak and obsession. "We can still be together, just us," she said, inching closer. Jacob's worst fears had come to life in a way he never imagined. His breath caught in his throat as Ella stepped forward, her grip on the knife tightening. There was an unsettling determination in her eyes. Before Jacob could react, Ella moved with chilling intent, striking Nora. Nora gasped, stumbling back as the blade made contact. She clutched her side, her face etched with disbelief, before sinking to the floor. Jacob let out a heart-wrenching cry and dropped to his knees beside his wife. "Nora," he called desperately, pressing his hands against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. Nora's eyes fluttered weakly as tears streaked her cheeks. Ella stood still, her hands trembling as the reality of her actions began to sink in. "I had no choice, Daddy," Ella said softly, her voice cracking as her resolve faltered. "She was taking you away from me." But her words lacked the certainty they once held. Slowly, her expression shifted from defiance to a profound sense of remorse. The knife slipped from her hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. "Why does this feel so wrong?" she whispered as tears streamed down her face. Jacob looked up at his daughter, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You didn't have to do this, Ella," he yelled, his voice trembling with anguish. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, but Jacob could think only of the woman in his arms and the daughter he no longer recognized. The life they had built together was now in ruins, fractured beyond repair. Please subscribe and turn on notifications for more interesting stories.